Okay. All right. So I'm assuming there are people on, and you can all hear me. This is Cindy Davidson. I'm the Education Director for SILA and the Education Trustee for SILA Foundation. This is our 4th webinar of 2019. We're very excited to be talking about insurance policies today with our illustrious speaker, Mr. Patrick Wraight. Patrick's the director of Insurance Journal's Academy of Insurance. He manages over 200 courses, all the instructors, weekly webinars, and he is helping to cultivate and develop insurance professionals for our industry. Patrick started out in commercial underwriting, moved to underwriter training, and in both classroom and online. So he's a super expert in both teaching and insurance. He's a frequent presenter. He's a member of the Society of Insurance Trainers and Educators, which I think is the first way I met you, Patrick, was at the site conference. And he's considered a thought leader in the insurance industry. So if you aren't following him on Insurance Journal or you aren't subscribed to the daily headlines on Insurance Journal, then you're missing out. Put that on your to-do list for today. Patrick has a pretty strong position in the property casualty insurance industry, but his insights really do apply across the industry. We're so excited to learn about how to read an insurance policy today from Patrick. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Cindy, and I think I underpaid you for that intro. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. And folks, we're glad to be with you today, and I look forward to spending some time talking about how we read insurance policies. And it's not like anything else that we ever do when it comes to the rest of our lives. And you pick up a magazine and you read an article here, an article there. You pick up a book and you read it from front to back, cover to cover. You pick up a newspaper, if anybody still does, and you read it. Okay, if you're me, you go to the comic section, then the sports section, then the news. So it's just, but insurance policies are just not like that. So let's talk about what we're going to do here today, what we've got. And I've got, let's make sure that we roll. There we go. Okay. So here's where we're going today. First I want to talk about singing the same song. And don't worry, you'll get how this all fits together. Well, then we'll get the lay of the land together. We'll pull out our dictionaries if we have to, and we have to. We'll go to conjunction junction. And if the song is not in your head, your childhood was not as good as mine. We'll grab a pen and we'll find some coverage, and then we'll go looking for exclusions, because you have to. And then if necessary, always have your flare gun ready. So here we go. You're here because you know that you should be able to read an insurance policy, or you're convinced that it's difficult to read an insurance policy. So let's just work from that assumption and understand most of the time you're faced with reading an insurance policy, it's because somebody's got a question and maybe they think you can answer it, or it could even be that you have a question and you feel like you can research it out yourself through your policy. So it's always got to do with a question, in my mind, why somebody's reading an insurance policy, unless you happen to be like me and some of my friends and you just read these things because they're fun. One of the point that I want to make is very simple, and then it requires some background. When you have a question, whether it comes from a customer or a peer or a friend, you have to level the playing field a little bit by making sure that everybody's looking at the same policy. Use the specific policy that you're thinking about. The policy that the question's based on, the policy that you're wondering about, go get it. Make sure you get the right policy, so that you're answering the right question. If I could just for a moment stand on my soapbox, it's difficult because in my line of work, I get questions that can be kind of vague. I get questions that are hard to answer because I don't have all the details. And part of that's because people don't want to burden me with the details. And when they ask questions, they sometimes want to give you the most succinct question they can. And the problem is that it's hard to answer that way. So let's talk about some incorrect questions. And one is, does an auto policy cover damages caused by icicles? By the way, some of these are real life examples of things that have happened in my life even. And the correct answer may be yes, it may be no, depending on the policy. Or how about this bad question? Is flood covered on a homeowner's policy? We often think of that as a no answer, but there are times when that could be a yes. Or how about this one? Will a homeowner's policy pay medical bills if a dog bites someone? Which even that just sounds terribly vague, doesn't it? And these are all just vague questions. That's what makes them bad. It makes them hard to answer, is the vagueness. So here's some better questions. How about this one? Does my current auto policy cover damages to my car when icicles fall from my roof and hit it? And by the way, the answer to that question was yes. When the icicles fell off the attic roof 30 feet in the air and hit the windshield of my car, yes, my auto insurance policy covered it. How about this one? Is flood a covered peril on the current ISO HO3 homeowner special form policy? And I know that sounds real technical insurance, but if somebody's an insurance professional, they're looking for a technical question to answer. In fact, flood is not generally covered on the current ISO HO3, but it could be depending on if there was an endorsement available. How about this one? Does this homeowner's policy pay for my neighbor's medical bills if the dog that I'm watching but I don't own bites her? That's a very specific question. And so I think you get the point, right? That it's not about asking the question in as broad a term as possible, but really the better questions are specific to what's going on in your mind or what could be the issue that you're concerned about. All right, now this is going to get really technical, which makes me very happy, and it may, but just stick with me for just a moment. The next thing you have to deal with is identifying who wrote the form, because that makes a difference. Knowing who wrote the form, especially if you're involved in the insurance industry, it gives you an idea of the general provisions of the policy, and it gives you a general idea of what the policy basically should look like. And one way you can tell who wrote the form is by looking at the copyright notice. At the bottom of most policy forms, you might see something like this that says Copyright Insurance Services Office Incorporated, and gives the year, or includes copyright material of Insurance Services Office Incorporated with its permission. These two copyright notices give you the idea that, number one, the first one that says Copyright Insurance Services Office, that's written by a specific company. That's written by ISO, the Insurance Services Office. The second copyright notice tells you that while they didn't write it, it includes some of their material. The problem with that is that it doesn't tell us how much of the material. So you've got a form that was modified or written by a carrier, and includes whether it's a sentence or 95% of its content. It includes language that was written by somebody else, by the Insurance Services Office, but it's different enough that it's not the actual form as written by them. Now, there are other organizations that write forms. There's also AAIS. There's also the Workers' Comp. And so these are just some ideas for how to find out who wrote the form. And again, in finding that out, it lets you know something about that language once you get used to reading it. Here's a super clue for you. Most personal lines policy forms are going to be carrier specific, based on ISO forms, or even not necessarily based on ISO forms. I know several carriers that very broadly differ from the ISO basic forms. Clue number 2, how do you find out who wrote the form? Well, clue number 2, the form number will tell you. All carriers and all entities that publish policy forms use some kind of form numbering system. And so if you watch those, you can learn about where it's come from. ISO form numbers are very specific in their patterns. They go with a 2-letter identifier and then 8 numbers. And the first 4 numbers make up the form number itself, and the second 4 numbers make up the addition of that form. AAIS forms are very similar. They have their own numbering system. You may see the first 4 numbers together rather than separated. ISOs creates them like this, with groups of 2, the 2 letters, 2 numbers, 2 more numbers, 2 more numbers, 2 more numbers. In some places, when you deal with specific carriers, they may add different letters to there. I used to work at one place where they would use the ISO form numbers, and instead of simply using that straight ISO form number, they would add to it an identifier that told you about who they were, so that they could have their own forms. By the way, this doesn't have much to do with who wrote the form per se, but it does help if we know what edition date we're looking at. If you have a form that's got multiple editions, an interesting study would be that if you take a look at the ISO CP 0010 from before 2005 and after 2005, you would see some very significant differences related to claims that came in from Hurricane Katrina. So it's worth paying attention also to the edition dates of those forms. So, okay, we talked about who wrote the form. Let's talk about what the form does. And for the definitive work on this, if you search policy form edition dates and put in quotation marks John Eubank, as you can see on my screen, that will bring up an article written by John Eubank that really is, it is the be all and end all of this conversation. It really would help you a lot if this is something you're interested in. The first 2 digits, again, like I said, with the ISOs, the first 2 digits tell us about the line of business. So CA means commercial auto, or CP means commercial property, or IL means interline. So that's the first 2. The second 2 digits create a category of those types of forms in the lines of business. So a CA00 refers to commercial auto coverage forms. A CP10 was a commercial property causes of loss form. CG00 is a commercial general liability coverage form. And a CG20 is an additional insured form in the commercial general liability. And then the third 2 digits give you the specific form within that subgroup. So CP0010 is the building and personal property coverage form. The CP0030 is the business income and extra expense coverage form. And without diving all the way into it, the last 4 digits, those are the edition dates. So they'll help you know when this form was last altered or edited. And again, that downloadable article by John Eubank will tell you everything you need to know about this, and it's super simple. So it's real good to read. It's a great article to have in your library. So we talked about singing the same song, making sure we've got the right policy form in front of us. Let's get the lay of the land. And at this point, it's important to look at a policy as a whole document. Now, if you're dealing with a homeowners or a personal auto policy, you may have limited numbers of forms and endorsements to deal with. We know that many times those personal auto policies or homeowners policies, they are a single document, and they could run 30 to 40 pages depending on the state and the policy. But the commercial policies, they are modular. So they're going to have many different forms attached to them to create a whole policy. And for the rest of our discussion today, we're going to deal specifically with the commercial package policy, because that will give you the broadest possibility of finding places where issues may come up, or where you may have to look in many places to find the answers that you're looking for when you're reading a policy. So, okay, let's find all the coverage parts. When you're looking at a commercial package policy, you'll find multiple coverage parts. And the package may include only a CGL or a commercial property, but it may include more coverage parts, including property, commercial general liability, crime, business auto, and liquor liability. And to find that out, you really need to look at the common declarations page, which is going to tell you all the different coverage parts that you're dealing with, which again helps you to set the stage for what you're trying to find out when you're looking for information in a policy. So why do you care what coverage parts are there? Well, it's because your answer may actually show up in different areas in the policy in different coverage parts. It's possible that multiple policies might address the situation that you're thinking about, that you're dealing with. So the first thing that you need to do is find the deck pages. Now that we've found all the coverage parts, we need to find those deck pages. And each coverage part in a commercial package policy has its own deck page. And each one provides specific information to that policy, including identifying coverage limits and limitations. So on a deck page, you would have all of the coverage limits that are available for that line of coverage, with some exceptions there. And then there's some limitations that will show up on that deck page there. They also identify covered locations, which is helpful if you're dealing with property or liability, because you want to know if the location that you're thinking about is covered for whatever the issue may be. They'll let you know if a vehicle is covered on the policy. It's possible that the only vehicles that have coverage are those that are listed in the policy. And it's also possible that coverage extends to any vehicle that the insured may use at any time. So you really have to pay attention to identifying where those covered vehicles are, and you find that out on the deck page. As a matter of fact, on the commercial auto or the business auto deck page, it'll tell you whether or not the only vehicles that are covered are listed, or if you've got coverage for vehicles that are not listed. And it'll also let you know what deductibles are there, and deductibles are an important issue for us. We know that. So as we look at all those deck pages, we're going to find out what about the endorsements that are attached to the policy. And it's important because endorsements change things. That's the nature of what an endorsement's put on a policy for. Of course, commercial policies are modular, and by that I mean that it takes several forms and endorsements to make up the complete policy. For example, an ISO commercial property policy might be made up of at least 8 forms and endorsement, not including the deck pages. So why do you need to know what endorsements are attached? So this also goes to why the endorsements are written. Some endorsements are written to clarify policy language. After Hurricane Katrina, there were hundreds of claims that turned into lawsuits over what happened to the building, over the water that came into the building. Was it considered flood, which would have likely been an excluded cause of loss? Or was it wind-driven water, which might have been a covered cause of loss? And that was central to a lot of those arguments. And so there was, after Hurricane Katrina, an endorsement created to clarify the water provision of the policy, what was covered and what was not covered. And come to find out, what the intention was not to cover wind-driven water or storm surge or all these other things that in one sense some courts said were flood, and some courts said they were not flood. So that turned into an argument, which turned into more policy language, which turned into an endorsement there. Endorsements sometimes provide additional coverage. On the business auto policy, you could add an endorsement called employees as insureds. This endorsement extends the definition of an insured to include employees to close some coverage gaps that could exist when you have employees using certain autos in your business. If you think about an employee that uses their personal auto on company business, if that employee gets into an accident, their personal auto policy will step in to protect them and the company. The business auto policy steps in as excess to protect the company, but not the employee. And that's one of those reasons why they might want that employees as insured's endorsement. And some endorsements restrict coverage. And there are any number of exclusionary endorsements available. And their purpose is, you guessed it, to exclude something from coverage, to say that we didn't mean to cover that and I don't want to cover that either. And with certain endorsements, such as the CGL endorsement, exclusion of designated ongoing operations, the idea is that there are some operations that the insured is involved in that the company just doesn't feel secure in insuring for the premium they're getting, so they are going to exclude those ongoing operations. They could be exceedingly risky. They may not be generally contemplated by the class code that they're using, or because it's not normal for the risk. I had one insured one time that was a fire department that had a teenage driver's safety course that they ran. And it wasn't just that they ran a classroom course, they actually had a track out back of the fire department where they would take teenagers in their cars and run them through a vehicle obstacle course, for lack of a better term. And that was not necessarily something that was anticipated for a fire department's liability coverage or their auto coverage. So it was an unusual exposure. Now, some endorsements are required by state law. It's just a fact that in order to get the policy approved, the state required that they make some changes peculiar to the state. And every state has them. Every state has got an endorsement that changes the notification requirements for cancellation or non-renewal, and every state's got its own peculiarities, in particular with auto. Where I live in Florida, every property policy has to be endorsed to remove sinkhole as a covered cause of loss and add in what we call catastrophic ground cover collapse, which means that you drove to the store and came back and your house was in a hole in the ground. But that's peculiar to here. And again, every state's got different peculiar endorsements that it likes. Okay. The dictionary. Part of the problem we have in answering questions about an insurance policy is how words are used. And we all know that language is how we communicate. We agree on the words we use. We agree on what they mean. If you're on the line with me, hopefully you understand the language that I speak. If you speak a different language, I may not be able to understand you. You may not be able to understand me. But the confusion happens when somebody changes how words are used. And nowhere is that more of a problem than in an insurance policy. Failure to properly understand the meaning of a word can lead to misunderstandings at best, and at worst could lead to a claim not being paid or have to be litigated later. That's why we're going to look at some of the places that you should look when you want to know what a word means. So we'll start by looking at the policy. Every policy will define some words. In fact, when you look at most policies, you will find a sentence similar to this. Throughout this policy, the words you and your refer to the named insured shown in the declarations. That's the definition of the word you in a commercial property coverage form. But you is not defined the same in all policies. Here's the definition from a CGL policy. Throughout this policy, the words you and your refer to the named insured shown in the declarations and any other person or organization as a named insured under this policy. So you see the differences here, right? The first definition ends at the end of declarations. That's it. You and your refer to the named insured shown in the declarations. That's it. On the CGL policy, we add the provision that any other person or organization qualifying as a named insured on the policy then is also you. That means that we have to go and look and see how many names are there on the policy in order to find out who the you is. And finding out who the you is, or finding out who the insured is helps us to figure out if there's coverage in the event of a claim. Let's move forward, take a look at a couple of other things. Let's take a look at some places in the policy where you can find definitions. There should be a definitions section. Now, some policies will have that at the beginning of the policy. Other policies may have it at the end. Most policies have a place where it says definitions. And if you have that in the policy, you go flag that, you find that, and you figure out what words need to be defined in the policy. And by the way, those words that are in the definitions section and are defined specifically, they have those quotation marks like we saw. We saw the you and your here. See there in quotation marks. Anytime you see a word in quotation marks in a policy, it's being defined specifically for that policy. So you can find them in the definitions section. Often if there's a word that's in bold print in the policy, a definition will follow it soon thereafter. Some of them are defined terms that you will have to deal with. If you look at the first page of the ISO CP 0010, Building and Personal Property Coverage Form, you'll find building under covered property. And then right after that, there's definition in the text that shows us what its coverage is provided for the building. And there are other places in the form where a definition just kind of shows up. And often on specific endorsements, a word is defined or even a phrase is defined. So you may have a definition section on an endorsement, or it could even be that the endorsement itself is largely a definition section. So you've got to pay attention to where these words are defined. Let me give you an example of a common word we all think we might know: employee. Now, you are probably thinking to yourself that I know what an employee is. An employee is somebody that works for me or somebody that works for the organization. And in general, you probably do know what the word means. And if you walked into a grocery store, saw somebody in the uniform for that store, you would think to yourself, that person's an employee. And so would I. So I'm going to take a look at what a policy, what the CGL policy says an employee is. So I'm looking at the CG 0001-0413 edition and how it defines an employee. An employee includes a leased worker, in quotation marks, so you know that's defined somewhere else. And an employee does not include a temporary worker. And folks, that's the whole definition of employee. So what is an employee? Well, at least we know that an employee, at the very least, includes a leased worker and probably almost everybody else working at that location, but not a temporary worker. And we don't know what that word means yet. So just let's move forward here and we'll see that a leased worker means a person leased to you by a labor leasing firm under an agreement between you and the labor leasing firm to perform duties related to the conduct of your business. So a leased worker is somebody who comes in and does work for you that is not necessarily your employee, but I didn't tell you the whole definition yet. There's a little bit more to it. There's one more sentence in there that's not on your screen. It says that a leased worker does not include a temporary worker. So in two places we've seen this term temporary worker. We don't know what that means yet. Let's keep going on. We got our definition for employee here. And now let's take a look at what a temporary worker is. A temporary worker means a person who is furnished to you to substitute for a permanent employee on leave or to meet seasonal or short-term workload conditions. So now when you go to the store, under this policy form, there could be people that are not considered employees on this policy in that store. Could be that if there's if it's summertime and you're going to the beach and they've hired a bunch of temporary summertime workers to help out at the shop at the beach, then that temporary worker may not be an employee for this policy. Do you see how important it is to make sure that we understand these definitions? Would it be important for that beach shop owner, the shop that sells t-shirts down by the beach, they've hired 3 additional salespeople for the summer because they know they're going to have more work for them to do. Wouldn't it be important for them to know that they are not an employee on their CGL policy unless it's endorsed to include them? Makes a difference. At least it might, in the event of a claim related to those employees. Okay, so I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that most of us are probably not attorneys, but it doesn't hurt to pay attention to when case law in your area might redefine a term. And I'm not asking you to become an attorney. I'm not asking you to study the law. But what I am asking is to pay attention around you. You should know when there are appellate courts in the state that you're doing business in, if they have a major insurance-related case. It'll better help you to serve your customers. For example, in the state of California, they had a case last year where the court redefined the definition of an employee, and they may be looking to pass legislation to codify a definition permanently. Therefore, then that definition of employee might supersede what's in the policy. So you have to pay attention to those things sometimes. And if all else fails, go look for your regular Webster's dictionary or whatever dictionary you like to use. If a word's not defined specifically in the policy and you don't know of any case law, then you can go look it up in a dictionary. I use dictionary.com when I don't know a word, and it happens a lot. If I'm looking at insurance policies, sometimes I'll go to Black's Law Dictionary online at thelawdictionary.org, and that way I can figure out what do these words mean from a legal standpoint. That will help me in defining the words from an insurance contractual standpoint. Okay, hopefully your head's not swimming too much talking about how words are defined. Hopefully you're enjoying this. I'm enjoying this, but we have to go conjunction junction. And yes, on purpose, hooking up words and phrases and clauses. I know most of us, when we got through English in high school or in college, said, I'm never going back there and I don't want to deal with it anymore. But the problem is that when you deal with insurance policies, you've got to deal with words. They're important. So let's look at some conjunctions. Now, what does a conjunction do? Now, according to the Grammarly blog, conjunctions are words that link other words, phrases, or clauses together, just like the song told us when we were kids. So why do we have to watch out for them? They're important when you're trying to read a policy because they indicate possible changes from what has come before. They're used in lists, and we'd all agree, I think, that a list with an or at the end is very different than a list with an and at the end. Let me show you. And we're going to look at this in the context of the ISO CG0001. And here's some policy language from the insuring agreement. We may, at our discretion, investigate any occurrence and settle any claim or suit that may result, but the amount we will pay for damages is limited as described in Section 3, Limits of Insurance, and our right and duty to defend end when we've used up the applicable limit of insurance in the payment of judgments or settlements under coverages A or B, or medical expenses under coverage C. The and here, well, I know there's a but, we'll deal with that in a little bit, but the and here links 1 and 2 such that they both limit payments and they both limit what the insurance company will do. The first limitation is the limitation on how much they will pay. It says we will pay for damages limited as described in Section 3, Limits of Insurance. So we know that there is a definite limit to how much will be paid out, and we will stop defending the insured when that limit's used up. It's a way of saying, well, our responsibility is complete. Therefore, if something else happens, don't come calling us. Could you imagine if that was an or? that makes things very different. So that and is an important and there. By the way, our right and duty to defend. In linking the right and duty, the insurance company has both right and duty to defend the insured when there's a suit or a claim, but they go together. There's a right and a duty. Very important. So let's now look at or. We talked about and, so here's some ors. Now I'm looking at a specific part, still looking at the ISO CG0001. And if anybody has any questions about the policy forms that I'm looking at, or you want to talk about those, get with me later and or ask away. I'm looking at the same policy for under the liquor liability exclusion, which says that bodily injury or property damage for which any insured may be held liable by reason of causing or contributing to the intoxication of any person, the furnishing of alcoholic beverages to a person or under the legal drinking age or under the influence of alcohol, or any statute, ordinance, or regulation relating to the sale, gift, distribution, or use of alcoholic beverages. You see, we've got an or in this list. These are all reasons that this exclusion applies. We're not covering bodily injury or property damage if the insured could be held liable for causing or contributing to the intoxication of any person, or the furnishing of alcoholic beverages to a person under legal drinking age or under the influence of alcohol, or any statute, ordinance, or regulation related to the sale, gift, distribution, or use of alcoholic beverages. So you see that only one of these clauses has to be true in order to be excluded here in this portion of the policy as we're reading through it. That or creates a potential list. It could be 1, 2, or 3, as opposed to when we saw the and, it was 1 and 2, both together. But, okay, we all know what but means in our life. We've all had the conversation that said, you did a great job, but I'm happy to see you, but we have a problem, but changes everything. Now here's but in the policy language. We may, at our discretion, investigate any occurrence and settle any claim or suit that may result, but the amount we will pay for damages is limited as described in Section 3, limits of insurance and our right and duty to defend, etc. This is a portion we already read. This is that but that we saw a little bit back ago on talking about the and. Where that but came from is that the insurance company says in the policy, we can, at our discretion, investigate any occurrence and settle any claim that may result. So we're trying to say we can do this without actually having to go to court, but we'll do that. But the most we're going to pay is the amount shown on the limits of insurance and our right and duty to defend end when we've paid out. So if what it's saying is that the insurance company can settle it out of court, and if they do that for the amount that's listed on the policy as the limit of insurance, then they have no longer got an obligation to go to court for the insured. And that's what that means there. That's what that but does. It changes the direction. Okay, one more. And I'm not hitting all the potential conjunctions out there. Just some of these major ones, and there are more that you could deal with, and we'll talk just briefly about them. However, here's the however. So as we go back to the liquor liability exclusion, we said that the bodily injury or property damage is excluded, and then at the end of that it says, however, if the occurrence, if this exclusion applies even if the claims against any insured allege negligence or other wrongdoing, etc., if the occurrence which caused the bodily injury or property damage involved that which is described in paragraph 1, 2, or 3 above, however, this exclusion only applies only if you are in the business of manufacturing, distributing, selling, serving, or furnishing alcoholic beverages. So the however really gives you a moment that says, I know what we said all this beforehand, but this is the truth. And so in the context of that liquor liability exclusion, what we said was that the insured is not covered for bodily injury or property damage related to the sale of alcohol, the consumption of it, giving alcohol to somebody, etc. However, the exclusion only applies if they're in the business of manufacturing, distributing, selling, serving, or furnishing alcoholic beverages, which gives the insured some coverage if they had a party in which they were serving those beverages and not that they weren't selling them. They weren't in the business of selling them. So that, however, really changes the tone of everything that came before it. And those are just a few examples of some of the conjunctions you have to watch out for. A couple of other examples include only if, unless, provided, and whether. Not the kind that we go outside and look at, but WHETHER. And all of those words make a change to the direction that the language is going. You have to pay attention to them. We got to move on now. So far we've determined that you know that you need to read a policy. We've verified that everyone looks at the same policy. We've looked at how the policy's put together and noted that there were endorsements attached. We pulled out the dictionaries and we talked about some conjunctions. Now it's time to look at some of these endorsements again. Earlier, we noted that they existed and we talked about why some of them existed. But while you're reading an endorsement, when you come across the endorsement, it's really important that you take a pen and start writing on both the endorsement and the other forms that it applies to. We recommend that you make some specific notes on the policy forms telling you what endorsements modify them. And by the way, the location where it modifies them exactly. I would draw a line, put an arrow, whatever it is. But what endorsement modifies that location, exactly what the modification, where it is, and in one sentence, how the endorsement modifies that part of the policy. And so we've already talked about what endorsements do, so we don't have to go back through that. But the idea is that if there's an endorsement that affects somewhere else in the policy, if you write it down and write down on the endorsement where it goes back to, maybe what page in the policy itself you can go back to, it will help you to be able to remember that whatever's here on one form is changed somewhere else, so that you don't miss something. I can remember one time where a person in underwriting missed that a policy provision was deleted entirely by endorsement, and they thought there was more coverage available to the insured than there actually was. Okay, find some coverage, and there's more than one way to do that. Every policy provides coverage based on how it's written. The problem is that you'll find that you can't find all the coverage in one spot. It'd be super easy if there was one place you could look to find the coverage that you needed to find, but the problem is that it's just not that way. You may have to go looking for coverage in some places you didn't expect to find them. And first off, in a lot of places, there is the obvious place to look under coverages. If we consider the CGL policy that we've been looking at, there are 3 places that you'll specifically see the word coverage, where coverage is provided under. Coverage A for bodily injury or property damage, coverage B, personal and advertising injury, and coverage C, medical payments. These 3 parts of the policy provide separate coverages, and they're clearly labeled so they're easy to find. And we can even guess what's going on by reading the titles. And this is the easiest part when you're looking for coverage. The problem is it's not the only place that you'll find coverage. In some policy, there are places called additional coverages, optional coverages, coverage extensions, or supplementary payments. And these are all titles that indicate that there's more coverage, and that's a good thing. Anytime you can find in the policy an additional coverage, a coverage extension, a supplementary payment, or even an optional coverage, you know that there's more coverage that the insured might have. So under the CGL policy, there is a section labeled supplementary payments coverages A and B. And that tells me that there's extra money available when there's a claim against coverage A or coverage B. So it reads this way: we will pay with respect to any claim we investigate or settle, or any suit against an insured we defend, all expenses we incur, up to $250 for cost of bail bonds required because of accidents or traffic law violations arising out of the use of any vehicle to which the bodily injury liability coverage applies. We do not have to furnish these bonds, and the cost of bonds to release attachments, but only for bond amounts within the applicable limit of insurance, and we don't have to furnish these bonds. You get the point. There's more supplementary payments in this section, but that this gives you an idea that there are more money available that doesn't count against the limit of insurance. These are additional payments. That's why it's called supplementary. Consider that in coverage A, we read that the insurance company can investigate and settle or defend a claim, but it didn't mention any of the costs associated with that. Here's where the cost of the legal team shows up if the insured has to go to court defending the claim. As before, you have to watch the policy language, because you'll note that one of the supplementary payments provides bonds related to accidents arising out of the use of vehicles, but only if that vehicle is covered under coverage A. That means that there are vehicles that the coverage doesn't apply to. Yep, that's an exclusion in the middle of providing coverage someplace. So now let's look one more place where we might find some coverage, and that's in the exceptions to an exclusion. Yeah, you can find coverage in an exclusion. So you might be wondering, how do I find coverage in an exclusion? Well, we'll look at a couple of things here. The simplest exclusion would be the aircraft, auto, or watercraft exclusion. And without reading the whole exclusion, you can scroll into the middle of that and find these words: this exclusion does not apply to. And then it explains that there actually are some aircraft, autos, and watercraft that can be covered by this policy. Again, we're not reading all of that for the sake of time, but you get the point here. So that sometimes exclusions, exceptions to exclusions provide coverage. Another spot is when you deal with this, however. You remember that liquor liability exclusion where it said, however, this exclusion only applies? Well, there's a place that you find some coverage there. That's finding coverage. And again, the reason that you have to learn how to read the policy is because you have to realize that sometimes where there's an exclusion, it's not a total exclusion. It doesn't exclude everything. And sometimes when there's coverage, there's not always all the coverage you think there is. And the coverage isn't always where you thought you'd find it. The last thing that we're going to look at here before we wrap up is looking for an exclusion, and an exclusion isn't always an exclusion. Consider the insuring agreement for coverage A on our CGL policy. We will pay those sums that the insured becomes legally obligated to pay as damages because of bodily injury or property damage to which this insurance applies. And that's as broad as the coverage ever gets on the policy. Think about it like this. Coverage A starts in the middle of the first column of page 1 on the form, if you look at it. And then the exclusions start at the top of page 2 and they run through page 6. So it's a lot of room for exclusions there. But where do we find exclusions? By the way, did you notice that the insuring agreement says we will pay those sums the insured becomes legally obligated to pay as damages because of bodily injury or property damage to which this insurance applies? Already setting up exclusionary language, because then that says that there are some claims that this insurance does not apply to, and that says that there are things that are not bodily injury or property damage that this coverage doesn't apply to. So let's look at some exclusions. And you would be right if you thought that some exclusions exist in the exclusion section. Here's some reasons why a loss would be excluded. It may be excluded because the loss is just generally considered uninsurable, like a war exclusion. The loss could be better covered somewhere else. On your CGL policy under coverage A, there's an exclusion for coverage B losses, and under coverage B, there's an exclusion for coverage A losses so that they're paid in the correct portion of the policy. Sometimes the loss is better covered on another policy altogether. You'll find on a CGL policy, there is an exclusion for your property because we want you to cover that on your property policy. There is an exclusion for autos, vehicles, and because we want them covered on an auto policy, or the aircraft and watercraft on different policies. In fact, with the liquor liability exclusion, if somebody's in the business of providing alcoholic beverages, there is a liquor liability policy they could get. Again, better covered on another policy. And we also are not going to cover losses that are not considered accidental. This policy includes an expected or intended injury exclusion, which excludes most bodily injury or property damage if the insured or expects or intends for it to happen. So let's look at some other places where there are exclusions. In the definition section, by defining a term, we limit coverage that can be provided in some way. Remember, we talked about the definition of an employee being an employee including a leased worker, but not a temporary worker. We've created then an exclusion for some folks that might otherwise be considered employees, except that the policy in defining the term has said that there's some that just are not covered there. Some exceptions to coverage. This is one of those places where you wish insurance language wasn't so complicated. It'd be nice to sometimes say, yes, it's covered, or no, it's not, but it just doesn't always work that way. When we talk about exclusions, one place an exclusion happens is in an exception to coverage. And it may actually state except. How about this? This insurance applies to bodily injury and property damage only if the bodily injury or property damage is caused by an occurrence that takes place in the coverage territory during the policy period, and prior to the policy period, no one knew about it. I'm shrinking down some policy language here, but do you see how this language then whittles down the potential number of claims that could be submitted based on the fact that we've limited only to what we want to cover by saying only if. And again, if there's an occurrence, if it's in the coverage territory during the policy period. And that was very fast, but let me just give you one more thought here. And as you read and study, especially if you don't have much practice, you might find yourself confused about what you just read. And let me just say it this way, that in my insurance life, I have looked at something and read the policy and read forms over and over again and thought I understood, and then I asked somebody for help, or I thought I knew the answer and then I heard somebody else explain it differently, or I thought I had no idea but I was actually correct. These can be confusing, folks, so it's never a bad idea to ask for help. If you need the help, ask, or if you just want the help, ask. And I'll tell you that as an insurance professional, as somebody who likes to read insurance policies, I sit in on different email chains with some friends, and we go back and forth about what a policy means, or how to help somebody interpret policy language. It can be very difficult, and nobody looks at anybody as being anything other than smart enough to say, hey, I don't know for sure. So it's always good to ask questions if you don't know the answer, and be willing to learn and hear from other people. And that's probably the key thing there, is to be willing to learn and learn from others. So that's all I have, and I have time for questions if there are any.
Patrick, it was really thorough, so you might not have any.
Well, folks, you're more than welcome to send in the questions, and I know that was super fast, and it feels like that we could talk about this thing for a long time. And if folks have any questions, that's not me, but you can call or email anytime.
I'm not seeing any questions yet. I'm seeing excellent presentation. Thank you. Many thanks. So I think everybody, it was very thorough. So I wouldn't anticipate a lot of questions. I know I will never read an insurance policy the same, and I feel empowered. And I thank you very much, Patrick, for teaching us today. It was very nice of you to donate your time like that, and we do appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for letting me come.
Okay. To everybody who's watching, remember, without your financial support, this webinar would not have been possible. You can always make a donation online at our website, SILAFoundation.org. With that said, that ends today's webinar. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.